Take it away, Brian.
Thank you, Rex. So hello, everyone. I'm Brian Train, and I'll be chairing this panel session on influence gaming. Someone just asked, are we going to be talking about influence gaming or gaming under the influence? And I think it depends on where you are in the world, in your time zone. It's quite early where I am, so sun's not over the yardarm just yet. It is over my elbow. What is influence gaming? To be circular about it, it's how we show the effects of influence operations in war games. Now, the RAND Corporation, in its bloated way, defined influence operations as the coordinated, integrated, and synchronized application of national diplomatic, informational, military, economic, and other capabilities in peacetime, crisis, conflict, and post-conflict to foster attitudes, behaviors, or decisions by foreign target audiences that further U.S. interests and objectives. So a lot of words and a US-centric conclusion. However, Jim Wellman, one of our panelists today, summarized all this in a blog post he wrote as doing stuff short of actually shooting people to get them to do what we want. I try to think whatever Jim Wellman thinks about things, so I'm going to go with his more succinct characterization. Now, in the post, Jim continued, obviously shooting at someone is a direct means of influencing their behavior, but in the modern world, much is made of influence as a means of changing your adversary's mind non-kinetically. Now, can we successfully and realistically reflect this in a game? This is what we're going to be talking about today, and this question is central to a recent project on the topic that was sponsored by the UK Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, or DISTL, and we'll be hearing from Jim and Graham Longley-Brown about this and other activities. Now, I've done a number of games that brush up against the concept of non-kinetic influences in different spheres and in different ways. Two examples I would offer were two I did on the 2014 Ukrainian crisis and another on the 2019 Kashmir crisis. They were simple enough in letting players combine threats of kinetic action, diplomatic jawboning, and maneuver through the more nebulous concept of what I, at the time, called information dominance. The Ukrainian game I designed over the weekend of the actual referendum in Crimea about remaining in Ukraine in the middle of March 2014, when it appeared that an overt Russian invasion was very likely. And getting it into its basic form took me only 48 hours. In general terms, it's a fairly simple Paul Mill game for two players that concentrates on the buildup and the resolution of a threatened territorial annexation of parts of Ukraine by Russia. An overt military invasion of eastern Ukraine is possible in the game, but it's not necessary, nor is it desirable to win the game. And meanwhile, while the Russian player postures, the Ukrainian player desperately mobilizes to defend himself, suppress internal revolt, and build a coalition of allies to support him. The main currency I used in the game to reflect all this was prestige, a word that kind of encompassed a kind of catch-all concept that encompassed a side's dominance, stability, resolve, and moral high ground. In the original version of the game that I first released onto the net, I compared prestige to the concept of having hand from a Seinfeld episode about the Pez dispenser. George is complaining about a relationship, and he says, I have no hand, Jerry. Where's my hand? Meaning he has no dominance. He cannot call the shots in the relationship. However, that illusion doesn't travel very well, and it wasn't included in later editions of the game. It was hard for me to articulate just what this meant without referring to a popular situation comedy, but this idea of having hand is central to influence operations. I dithered a lot about what to call it before I ended up calling it prestige. So in the game, it doesn't quite have the positive connotation of respect or high esteem that it normally does in English. It was a quantification and a combination of several things, including the amount of intimidation or dominance a player could exert on, or the compliance they could extract from the other player countries portrayed in the game, the general stability or resolve of the respective governments to pursue the crisis, particularly with respect to using military force. It also encompassed the country's international standing and its ability to control or shape information on events, and to a lesser extent, the country's overall economic health and future prospects. Now, there were occasions during the game when the player could voluntarily expend prestige to get something they want. This represented making deals for future concessions, political or diplomatic negotiations, threats that might not be delivered, and so on. And the game ended if one player's prestige score was reduced to 0 at the end of any turn. This would signify a collapse of will to continue, or resignation to the situation, or conclusion of some form of negotiation process going on outside the frame of the game itself, at which time victory is judged. It was also a time-limited game, so that after the end of a certain number of turns, you would stop, and the scale of victory was determined by the point spread between the two antagonists. I also worked this aspect of non-kinetic dominance into the combat system of the game. In this game, players could engage in kinetic, asymmetric, or symbolic combat. Symbolic combat is an acknowledgement to me that modern regular armed forces are so small, expensive, and difficult to maintain compared to what we've seen in the mass armies of the past, that it makes some sense to use them in near ceremonial combat posturing. Often just it's enough to have it, to show it, to swan it around, somewhat the same way that dreadnoughts were used before World War I. And unlike the first two forms of combat that end up with casualties, unit neutralizations, and inevitable civilian casualties, the only losses and gains in symbolic combat on either side were merely in prestige. So people generally didn't get hurt, but they would come out of it looking bad, and that was the currency in the game. So sometime later, in a Connections UK presentation, John Curry mentioned this game, and he observed that in his opinion, I had gotten it half right, but he never did say which half. Later, in 2019, I put together an even simpler game on the Kashmir border crisis between India and Pakistan in the aftermath of the Pulwama suicide attack in February 2019. Players drew hands of cards from a deck of ordinary playing cards and placed them on different fronts. Placing a card on a front represented using resources and abstractly showed the scale of effort a country was investing in obtaining a favorable result in that particular sphere of activity. So there were 3 fronts that I had for players to resolve conflict on. First one, military, which represented a straightforward application of covert and overt military force, or in this case, preparations for large-scale conventional operations. Second was diplomatic, which was concerning a country's efforts to get international support and assistance for its viewpoint, or to condemn the enemy's viewpoint, or to pursue legal and economic threats and harassment against the enemy. And finally, information. Again, a somewhat more nebulous concept, but it related to message dominance and ability to control the narrative on the conflict. So the common thread here between these games was related to the strength and ubiquity of messages, and ultimately the ability to control narratives on the conflict. I mentioned these 2 examples, but I've never been really satisfied with how to treat the technical amenities of the internet, or digital communications generally, and social media. Or at least how to treat them differently or focus on them specifically, as if these 2 technical innovations represented something entirely new or radically different from the age-old techniques of psychological warfare. Psychological warfare, of course, the techniques have gotten tremendous boosts through technology, first with movable type, widespread literacy and mass education, radio, TV, and political military exploitation of the dark arts of advertising and market research. But the content of the messages remains much the same. And consequently, I'm very interested to hear what our panelists are going to say in answer to the questions we've posed of just how do we gain social, political, and diplomatic influence in an age of digital communications and social media. Now, one important feature of our world, our online world, is disinformation and misinformation, things that are not new in themselves. In 1710, Jonathan Swift wrote, "Falsehood flies, and the truth comes limping after it, so that when men come to be undeceived, it's too late. The jest is over and the tale has had its effect."